defensibility of data, and you say these data are valid, what does that mean? So we're going to talk about terminology, and we're going to talk about the legal underpinnings of your being able to defend your data and what that means in terms of documentation. The legal definition of data is anything that supplies facts or helps establish a fact. So not just numbers, training records, emails, anything that helps establish the validity of your data is also data. In terms of science, there's quantifiable data, right? There are numbers, the values that you produce, for example, taking measurements of air temperature. So the numbers that are produced on your thermometer. Quantifiable data also includes more than or less than, and that usually comes into play in environmental data because fortunately so much of what we measure can come back non-detectable. So less than that concentration that the laboratory can detect it. That's quantifiable data. Data also needs to be repeatable. This is a huge concept that relates to the scientific theory, right? The scientific theory is that we select a postulate. We say, I think the air temperature is between 70 degrees and 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Then we make measurements, and then we say the air temperature is 85 degrees. Well, the fact that it is scientifically credible implies that you could go back out there and make those measurements again, and if you could repeat all the same conditions, it would be 75 degrees again. So repeatable, and that includes documented. It's not enough to say, well, I went out there and measured the temperature again and it was the same. Documented. It's important to remember that what makes data repeatable is somebody else asking the same questions or doing the same work would get the same answers. And that means they have to know the conditions under which the measurement was made. Both science and law use this term utility or usefulness. The validity of data means that you have to understand how it's going to be used. So data can be used for valid purposes and can be completely useless for other purposes. And that's important to the validity of the data. It's not just like these numbers are valid. These numbers are valid for establishing the air temperature, not for establishing any concentration of pollutant in the air. The quality of documentation is important. To reiterate, the definition of documentation is anything that helps establish the foundation, the authenticity, or the relevance leading to the truth, which is probably, for example, the parts per billion in ozone that you've measured that your data show. So, for example, logbook entries where something is done at the site, perhaps recalibrating flow rate of a PM monitor. So those logbook entries, what the site operator wrote, is supported by the site operator's reliability training, which is itself supported by training records, previous successful audits, the resume of the site operator saying they've been to lots of ITEP trainings, they work for another tribe, or whatever their experience shows, that basically says that this logbook entry is correct in what it says and this person did what they said they were going to do. The quantity of documentation is something that unfortunately you're going to get sick of hearing about because you're going to want to actually have redundant documentation. If you have documentation in a site logbook and you don't have documentation anywhere else, that puts that site logbook at risk of getting burnt up in a fire, lost, stolen. These things happen. You're going to want to make your documentation to some extent redundant. You're going to make sure you take use of your cell phone camera and take pictures, make notes, make sketches, the computer files, email records. Don't assume that one documentation is conclusive in itself. If you've got all sorts of evidence showing that you operated this particulate matter monitor in the correct way, you did the required QC checks, and you assert your data are valid, as much documentation as you have that's organized and retrievable that you can support your measurement results, the better. There's two kinds of evidence: direct evidence and circumstantial evidence. Direct evidence is directly providing a fact, like a photograph, a signed statement, a report. This is the data or raw data. These are the hourly results. That's direct evidence. Circumstantial evidence is indirect. So, for example, if you're monitoring and you have a gap in your data, but you have evidence from an email that was sent out by an electrician for the school where your monitor is sited on the roof of, saying that there was a power outage from 3 to 4 on Thursday, then that is circumstantial evidence that that's the missing data in your data set. Well, you've got another piece of evidence that says, well, this is what happened to this other piece of evidence. And both kinds are used in environmental data. Primary records are raw data, chain of custody forms that are scribbled all over, field data sheets, instrument logbooks, personal logs. Those are primary records. You don't have to keep these forever. What you can do is scan them using your phone, save them as PDF, and keep them forever. So even though EPA rules say keep them for 3 years, I try to keep everything I can, at least in scanned form. Metadata is information about your data. So data about the data. The metadata is all the information about where the site is, other information about what's nearby the site. It is important to know what has to be recorded along with your data, and your quality assurance project plan is going to specify that. So examples, every time you write in a logbook, write the time, date, your initials, where you are, what you're doing. Metadata can be automatically stored, which is convenient, especially emails. Send emails to yourself. That is so useful because then it's stored on a server somewhere. You can retrieve it, you can sort your emails, and there's a record that you made this documentation at this point in time and sent this email. Other information can be useful, and you may not know ahead of time what information you're going to need. So write it all down. I've encountered this many times myself, where only looking back in time and noticing that that was every Friday, for example, that I noticed that something different was happening with the power on Fridays, and we were able to track down and fix something. And that is direct evidence. What you write in your site logbook is very important. Photographs are easily used. Make sure you take pictures, and then your phone's going to get filled up. Email them to yourselves with in the subject line what the picture is of. You can go back and file those in a folder on your computer about the site, and you'll have information about how the trees are growing and how visibility changes at your site, for example. Use Post-its. If you want to take a picture of something, your analyzer's looking weird, you've got some dust buildup, write the date and time on a Post-it note, stick it next to the thing, take a picture of it, and email it to yourself. Legal defensibility is all about your quality assurance project plan. So there was this case, Dober versus Dow Pharmaceuticals, in which the judge set precedent by saying these things need to be in place in order for the data that were at the heart of this lawsuit to be legally defensible. And they are, guess what? The 24 elements of a quality assurance project plan. So the QAPPA elements, which is planning, that you document that planning was performed, the plan included a clear objective, there were QC criteria for the measurements, there were procedures that were at least referenced, there was training. So this is all going to be in your QAPP. So that's why people have to have a QAPP in order for their data to be legally defensible. These will look familiar also. The QAPPB elements. This is actually doing the work. So the activity was implemented. When things didn't go as planned, that was documented in a logbook. There was some management overview of how the project was conducted. There was QA overview. Somehow, basic QA assessment has to be done, even if it's you putting on a different hat, saying, I'm going to sit back and look at this data now, and if I have any questions about it, I'm going to call somebody, perhaps at ITEP, to talk about whether or not this data is valid. So there's some review of the data, and it's documented that when things went wrong, there was corrective action, and that was documented. The measurement devices were calibrated. That's huge, hugely important. And when things go wrong, which they are always going to in every project, they were recorded and resolved, and guess what? Documented. A QAPP, and I'm not going to lie to you, it generally is a little bit tedious at the least, but use it to your advantage to make sure that whatever you do, you don't want to waste your time. I spent 2 weeks in the field with a whole team of people measuring radon concentrations in people's homes, only to find out after the study was done and finding really high radon concentrations, thousands of picocuries per liter, that our instruments were not calibrated. Don't waste your time and embarrass yourself like that. So there has to be quality control criteria, beginning with calibrating your equipment. What to do when QC criteria were not met. How to validate and invalidate data, and compare your results to results from similar work. This is really important in the legal field, and it's just common sense. Do these results make sense in terms of what other people are finding in a similar environment? Also should be in your quality assurance project plan, data integrity, which just means that you have a full set of information. You don't have big gaps in your email records. You don't have big gaps that are unexplained. Make sure that if you use any secondary data, like data from the National Weather Service, the quality is known. Reconstructing evidence. It's perfectly acceptable to add to notes later, for example, in your logbook, and you have to add notes to QC sheets, for example, as you review the results, as if somebody else reviews the results, if you realize that you did the calculations wrong. But you need to keep in mind the rules of reconstructing evidence. First is reproducibility. The notes must be complete enough to allow somebody else to follow your train of thought and to see exactly how you got to that information. And in every case, you have to put down your initials, the date, and the time, and say, I am correcting this. I misread the time based upon the time I got to my truck. I realized the time I finished the QC check was this time, for example. Makes sense to somebody else. The supporting documentation must be referenced. So, for example, if you have an email that you use to go back into your logbook and say, we're invalidating this data because there was a controlled burn, and I got an email from the Forest Service stating the time and location of this controlled burn, you put in your logbook the date and the from of that email so that somebody else could find it and say, oh yeah, this makes sense. That's why that data was invalidated. If at all possible, you can just print out a copy of the email and tape it into your logbook. I've got things taped into my logbook like every other page. Any important assumptions are written down and write in ink, initial, and date. Always in ink, and never use whiteout or cross it out. Just put a line through it and an explanation and the new value.